Welcome in once again to the most accurate podcast here at 4for4. I am Matt Okada. That is John Paulson. How you doing, John? We are back to hump day again.
Yeah, Wednesdays, right? Every Monday and Wednesday, it's been kind of been the schedule. I'm doing all right. A little later in the day, and I'm excited. I think when you asked me to start asking some of my contacts in the industry to join us on the Most Accurate podcast, this is one of the first guys, if not the first guy, I reached out to. He's actually been a regular on the Most Accurate podcast for years and years. Right now, he's with Fantasy Life. Chris Allen, thanks for joining us.
Of course. And John Paulson, this is the question for you. Do you remember like the first words I ever said to you, like when we were in Slack together? Like this is like however many years ago. Do you remember the first words I said to you?
I do, and it made an impact on me. It was very nice of you to say. You're like, "Oh my God, I'm talking to John Paulson." Like I was some kind of hero to you.
That is correct. Yeah, yes, sir.
Oh man.
So no, like in my time in this industry, like being able to work with you and contribute to 4for4 is one of the better times I can remember, like being in this industry. So no, like the fact that I was able to contribute to this podcast, work with you, and alongside the many analysts that have come through 4for4 and BetSpert's doors. I mean, it's dope. So no, I'm more than happy to come back and chat with y'all and ramble for a little bit about fantasy football before things get too hectic. We got live football like tomorrow.
Ooh.
Yeah. So think about that for a second. I know with all the off season, like the time that we had to relax over the off season, all that stops tomorrow. We get actual live football. But no, without all that being said, I mean, appreciate y'all having me back for real.
Yeah, I feel like maybe I'm more the guest here even than you are, given the amount of times you've been on here. But just before we get into the show, let everybody know what you're doing now, where you are, and what you're up to.
Yeah, so I had the opportunity to go and work over at Matthew Berry's Fantasy Life, the free newsletter, draft kit that was actually dropped earlier today. You can find like all the awesome work like from our analysts like Dwayne McFarland, Ian Hartitz, Kendall Valenzuela, like Peter Overzet, like so many good folks like working over there. And you can find some of my contributions right now. I've been doing this draft series, kind of walking through what you can expect and how you can build like viable contending rosters for redraft purposes using our draft champion tool, which kind of walks you through like each round of the draft using different draft strategies. You can even select how aggressive or not aggressive the AI bots that are drafting against you will be. It's a pretty useful tool in order to help set expectations for each round and for each phase of the draft. So I've been walking through some of that. We've got the magazine that's been out since like the May, June-ish timeframe. You can find some of my sleeper articles like throughout some of that, which I'm sure we'll be referencing a little bit like earlier today. But right now it's just, man, we're just trying to get through to the earlier parts of the regular season. I just need that. It's almost like when you do that like ice bath challenge where I need that initial shock. Get me through that first week so I can remember like what it's like to get through this like massive dump of information that we're going to get once we get through week one. And then after that, we're off and running. But come find all of our like free content, legitimate free content over at fantasylife.com if you ever get a chance.
Cool. Absolutely. We've got a big show with 15 deep sleepers coming up. But before we get to that, Chris, you are a bit of an expert or have done a good amount of research at the very least on weather and its impact on fantasy football. So we wanted to give you the floor a little bit, just kind of talk about what you've found in your studies, what kind of impact we should expect it to have. Tell us what you know. Give us the inside info.
All right, so let's see. Where's the best place to start? Weather, the best place to start is that it doesn't matter. And I will say that knowing as much as I know now that for the large amount of like the times where we'll hear people talking about, oh, the weather is 15 miles an hour or it's 17 miles an hour and like all this other stuff. And you'll see a number of analysts, like casual or in-depth, like you'll see like the long Twitter threads talking about this is what happens when the weather's blowing at like 18 miles an hour and like all this other stuff. But for the most part, it doesn't matter. It's the extremes that actually do matter. And that's what I found like doing most of my research. But the thing is, like we get it, like there's some cognitive bias where when you see some of these extreme weather games, you will always extrapolate like those results to being like, that's the way it's always going to be. Like, for instance, what was it? The cold weather game we just had like during the playoffs last season. It's Tua Tagovailoa and like all the like the Dolphins going from nice, warm, sunny Miami and having to go play in like these like 0-degree temperatures like in Kansas City. And we knew without a doubt that this was what like they were just going to completely flounder and not perform as well, at least according to expectations. This was the same offense that dunked on the Broncos for 70 points like just a few months earlier and all of that. And of course, like lo and behold, what happens? Like their pass rates like dipped a little bit. Tua doesn't perform as well. I mean, let's just go ahead and toss aside the fact that Tyreek Hill had been dealing with injuries for the last like 6 weeks or so beforehand. Let's go ahead and toss aside the fact that they were really like hinging on what Raheem Mostert like continuing to do his like Iron Man thing at like age 30-ish and like continuing to run roughshod over the rest of the league. I mean, all the stuff that they were doing, while great, the efficiency, all that was probably going to be something of an issue for them, like even going into the playoffs, just because what they had done was such an outlier performance. Even Jalen Waddle, right? Like him going in and out of the lineup throughout most of the season due to injuries as well. All of that stuff set aside the fact that it's just the Dolphins going to Kansas City, playing in the cold. And lo and behold, this is what happens. And I think that is what we'll always extrapolate, is that if you see something bad happen in a cold weather game or like a high wind game, you will always say that this is what's going to happen like for the rest of the time. And I guess my pushback against that idea is that in some games the impacts like aren't as severe. It's not as drastic as most folks would say it. I think part of the problem is it's really due to sample size. One of the things I was looking at, go and check out my article again, like over at fantasylife.com. And then this was from like last year when I wrote it, looking at just the number of games, like since like 2018, over 1,300 regular season games. And just looking at wind alone, and we want to talk about like extreme conditions, the number of games where recorded wind speeds over 20 miles an hour is just like about 50. That's it. Like that's all that's out of like the past like 5-6 years of data. We only have like less than like 5% of the games where we can actually start to look at and extract legitimate trends about like what's actually happening in these games and what we can actually take from them in order to actually have accurate projections, like we know that John Paulson does on a week-to-week basis, and start to better understand like what these teams are going to do and what we can expect out of them, other than just summarily saying, oh, it's high winds. Oh, the teams, they're not going to pass as much. Oh, it's high winds. Oh, just like whatever deep ball game is going to happen. Like, no, just completely toss all that out of the window. Patrick Mahomes in like high winds. No, we can't do any of that. Let's disregard the fact that Patrick Mahomes' average depth of target year over year has been decreasing. But if it's high winds, definitely going to be bad. So like one of the impacts that one of the things that I did happen to find out is that like for a lot of these teams and for a lot of these quarterbacks, pass rate over expectation does drop, but it's only around like about a 1% drop. Not as drastic as you would think, like in the aggregate, looking at all of the samples, like for in these extreme conditions. Completion percentage over expected. So that's like the accuracy, like what you would expect for a lot of these quarterbacks. Really, that stays about nominal, like around like a 1% difference, like from what we would expect for a lot of the baseline production for these quarterbacks. But plays run, that does actually take a dip, and this is for wind speed only, drops about 2 to 3 plays per game. So if we're only talking about a slight dip in pass rate, a slight dip in completion percentage over expected, and also a drop in plays per game, is it really going to be as much of an impact to say that if you are looking at a game that's going to be over 20 miles an hour, you should completely stay away from it? I say no, and I think it requires a bit more nuance than just looking at the weather and then just and saying that, well, no, like I'm not going to invest, or I don't want to start my players in that type of an environment. Because you mean to tell me that if you had Patrick Mahomes on your roster and there was a weather game that had 20 miles per hour, you're looking for another quarterback off of the wave at that point? You're not doing that, right? Like you are trying to at least try. So there has to be some nuance applied. And at least with the research that I've been able to put together, it gives us a set of expectations to say that there is going to be an impact, but it's not going to be as drastic as we tend to believe, or as we've seen in some cases. So at least apply some nuance, try and look at the two teams, the two offenses that are going to be playing in that game, versus just saying like bad weather means bad game. And that's not always the case.
John, it's a lot of good stuff. How much have you learned, from Chris and what he's looked into on this, but also how much does it matter to draft rankings, let alone when we get in the season, we're looking week to week. Right now, we're talking, where are we taking these guys in drafts? Do you take that into account at all?
I think for draft rankings, it's almost completely useless. Or not useless, but I wouldn't even take it into account other than Pat Fitzmaurice made an interesting comment about Deshaun Watson late games in Cleveland is the one, weather situation that yearly seems to come up where there's some bad weather games in Cleveland. And they, so that would be, it's just another reason for me to fade Deshaun Watson. So
I'm with that.
Yeah. So the reason we wanted to have you on, Chris, is to talk about this is more like, how should you deal with these roster decisions, starting lineup decisions in season? And what I've noticed over the last season, I think the year before, it just seemed like there was just long stretches where there was just no weather games. And I call them weather games. And when they pop up, my first thing is, okay, DM Chris, see if he's got an article up. Like, what's going on? What does he think of this? Because usually 9 times out of 10, we don't need to adjust for it. It's 18-mile-per-hour wind or 15-mile-per-hour wind, or the forecast is kind of wild and it's actually not going, like what people are saying on Twitter doesn't match up with what we're seeing from the weather service, right, Chris? So, so from a wind standpoint, I don't really adjust unless I see 20 plus. And then what we'll usually see coinciding with that is the total starts to drop in Vegas. And so what we have with our system, our baseline projections are based on the line and the total, along with what those teams have done to year to date in terms of all the team stats. So what I'll do if I see the total drop 2-3 points plus, I'll rerun the projections, and that will start to naturally move players around and, kind of discount some of the passing and change some of the total plays and all that, because of the total. Whenever the total number of fantasy points generally goes up with the total for the game. So that's one thing that's really useful about the 4-for-4 system. And then I will dig in a little deeper. I start pulling up the weather stations around the stadium, and I might clip it and I might send it to Chris and say, does this mean anything to you or not? And one of the questions as you were talking, Chris, that I wanted to maybe have you explain to readers, and I don't mean to put you on the spot if you don't know the exact numbers, but as far as rain or snow, is there a level where you start to get worried about a down, inches per hour, either just a precipitation for rain or for snow?
Actually, yes, I do have the number off the top of my head, which really and that's why I thank God that I'm married, because if I tried to explain this to a single woman, at any point in time, I would never get a second date. Cause this is god awful. Yes, I do actually. So for the weather service oh man, I forget the acronym. Either way, 0.01 inches to 0.03 inches of rain, continuous rain, per hour. You won't even notice it. If you're watching just the normal, the regular view, the field view camera, on just on a normal Sunday or Thursday or whatever, you won't see any of that. Now, if it happens to accumulate, so if say this is a rainstorm that's happened throughout the day, up until the time that actual kickoff happens, then there is a chance for accumulation. There is a chance for slipping. There is a chance for just random acts of, oh, this player fumbled the ball because they had bad footing or whatever, or the ball just happened to deflect off a player's hands, or just chaotic stuff that we can't really account for. But for anything that's over 0.06 inches per hour, that is where you can actually see the rain coming down, pelting the players, and you see it on their helmets. And that's where large accumulation can happen on the field, almost not instantaneously, but throughout the course of the entire game. And so that's where I've actually increased my research and started to look into field types. So if a field is actually if they use the turf, or they actually have any sort of piping that runs underneath to help with drainage, So like the Packers Stadium like does this because of course how often it happens to snow up there. The Patriots Stadium, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly, they also have that. So it's a lot of those stadiums that are in like the northeastern part, and even like Denver Stadium that typically deals with snow, because you would want to have a way in order to remove some of the precipitation, like after it melts and after it thaws. So for anything over 0.06, that's where my ears start to perk up a bit. And anything over like 0.1 inches, that is like legitimately a downpour. And that is where I would start to put a downtick on both passing rates, and then you would most likely see the game total start to drop. The only service, that, at least that I know of, that provides some of that, at least as a part of their like regular forecast, I use Weather Underground. I think there are a couple others that also do it, but at least that's the one that I've typically gone to, also because I can just like, snatch some of their data and like use that in order to help. Like when John and I have talked about stuff in the background, we'll just send each other screenshots of that site back and forth. But those are the numbers I typically look at. If it's anything under like 0.06 inches per hour, not all that concerned about it. Anything above that, and especially once you get to 0.1 inches per hour, that's where I'm like, all right, we really need to like reassess like this game and figure out, like, that would put you in that extreme situation where you do now have to apply some nuance as to whether or not you really want to have players from that game on your starting roster.
Tons of good stuff. I think the main takeaways are it has to be really extreme to really matter, and follow Chris on Twitter and maybe try to get into his DMs if you're as lucky as John.
No, don't bother. Just don't bother with the DMs. That's my domain. I would just add too that this has become more important to me just because you want to be accurate in your rankings.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a year, and I forget the year. It was the Philadelphia snow game when LaShawn McCoy in the blizzard went completely crazy, right? And they didn't pass the ball at all, right? And I think it was 2014. I was second in Fantasy Pros, and that was like a late season game, right? I was second in accuracy, and I totally biffed that game in terms of the rankings.
Oh no!
And I stayed in second instead of winning I think it was my second consecutive. It would have been my second consecutive.
2013.
Yeah. So, so then at that point I was like, okay, I need to pay more attention to to the weather and get a little bit more accurate. That's why you look at what your process is every year and try to improve it.
Yeah, and like some of the stuff, like there's so much nuance that you don't even think about until you start diving into the research, and some of it might make some sense. So like I just walked you guys through like the extreme, like 20 miles an hour. Like we'll just call that like just the nominal threshold is like where I start to think about things like differently in terms of like assessing the pass game, so on and so forth. But 20 miles an hour, but now let's think about it as like how the stadium is actually positioned. And this is where the stuff gets really nerdy. Again, thank God that I'm married already. So say if the wind is blowing with you, like it's at your back and like pointing forward, like 20 miles an hour, you really don't care about that as much because it's less of a chance that it's actually going to affect a pass or anything like that because it's going with you. It's almost like it's like with golf, right? If the wind's like at your back, it's like you don't really care. It's like I'm probably going to shank it anyway, but either way, like the wind at your back is actually going to help you like get some more yardage off your swing, so on and so forth. But now switch it and say that, well, instead of 20 miles an hour with or against you, because that's more of a simple adjustment. Think about if the stadium's pointing this way, but the wind's coming across with a cross breeze. So that changes things, not just passing, but also affects kicking as well. Affects kicking even more because the ball's even higher up in the air and allowing for the air to actually change the path of the ball. So that's where, again, applies an even like more nuance to say that, well, it's not just how fast the wind is blowing, but in what direction the wind is blowing relative to the way that the stadium is positioned. So I do have a map of for each stadium, like how like the azimuth, so their position like relative to true north. Again, massively nerdy, but then also like the stadium height for each of them. I've mapped that out as well, because if you do have like a shorter stadium, so like the Bill Stadium as of right now, one of the shorter ones, doesn't provide as much of a natural barrier as would be, let's say, the Giant Stadium, like which is much higher and completely enclosed. So if you do have like even like 20 miles per hour at, let's say, the Brown Stadium, because they do have it's fully enclosed, and also like it is one of like the taller stadiums where we've actually watched Browns games like where it's been over 20 miles an hour. This is when Baker Mayfield was still the quarterback and completely ineffective. passing rates were still the same, CPOE was still the same, plays run during the game were still the same, but it did actually go exceed that particular threshold. So that's where, again, more nuance needs to be applied to each of these events versus just saying, all right, this is bad, I'm just not going to play anybody. Well, you probably weren't starting anybody attached to Baker Mayfield anyway. I digress. But it's still important to understand that it's not just the number, but also the direction, where they're playing at, so on and so forth, before you can just say all right, I'm just going to completely stay away from this game.
I'm glad that you brought that up. I was going to, but I didn't want to show your nerddom. But that's the level of insight you get with Chris. So make sure you're following him on Twitter.
Oh, I'm probably on some sort of government list of why is this dude looking up architectural information about each of these stadiums? We should probably look into this guy.
Let's keep an eye on this guy.
Yeah, let's keep an eye on him. Oh, he's just a nerd.
I'm going to go on a limb here and say that most of the people watching or listening to the 4for4 podcast in end of July are pretty nerdy. So I think this hits the audience. Really good stuff. But we have more really good stuff. So let's leave the weather behind, and then we'll see it again in November.
Yes.
And let's get to these deep sleepers. Chris, you've been talking a lot, but I'm going to kick it to you first. So I hope you're ready. Kick us off with, we're going to go through each position. We each have one, and then we're going to have a flex, super flex, technically, although I don't know if anyone picked a quarterback. Let us know who you're looking for. These guys are all going in, I think we lined it up to be 12th round or later. Many are quite a bit later than that. So who's your quarterback?
My quarterback's going to be Geno Smith of the Seattle Seahawks. I think last season, the combination of he suffered that elbow-ish, somewhere elbow, upper shoulder injury or whatever, late in the season. But I think that his style of play combined with having Shane Waldron there, while it did seem to work in the season prior, when he had his comeback player of the year, they wrote me off. I ain't right back though, the whole thing. But then you see some of the incongruency with how Shane Waldron typically liked to call plays, and now Geno Smith wants to play quarterback. Stylistically, he is that quarterback that does need a little bit more time in the pocket, is more aggressive. From an air yards per attempt standpoint, Geno does typically sit around the 8.5, 9 yards per attempt, but also the receiving routes that he was that Waldron was calling, the concepts that they were using weren't as, I guess, conducive to being efficient. You've got a guy like DK Metcalf that can still be your primary X receiver, but also tacking on a guy like Jackson Smith-Njigba who can still could still be efficient, but the routes weren't all that efficient, or they weren't conducive to really I guess bringing forth a lot of their skill sets. Didn't use a ton of motion, a lot more 12 personnel because of the interior, the injuries to the interior offensive line. My thought is that's going to change for this season. Ryan Grubb, coming up from the college ranks, from the Washington Huskies, much more still called an aggressive offense for Michael Penix, when he was still there. And we also, of course, since we all the wide receivers that the Huskies were tossing out last year. From Jalen Polk to Rome Odunze, all those guys. It at least gives some credence to the idea that this should be a boon for Geno Smith in 2024. They were still Ryan Grubb, his offense, they still had over a 10.4 yard average depth of target from a passing standpoint. 21.5% deep ball rate, which fits in that was top 10 in the FBS last year. Again, that really does align with what Geno Smith likes to do from a deep ball standpoint. But like I mentioned earlier, the lack of motion or pre-snap motion, that's become such a large thing now in the NFL the past couple of seasons, about being able to make sure that your number one or number two wide receiver, they're able to at least either tip the hand of the defense to the quarterback, but also give at least easier, not free releases, but easier releases for your wide receivers. So a guy like DK Metcalf, that would definitely help, especially given his size, or even Jackson Smith-Njigba, like I just mentioned earlier. But that was a staple for Ryan Grubb. So to say that all of these concepts, including not from just the pre-snap motion, but also the use of 2 tight end sets or 12 personnel, which could be why like Noah Fant has now been like the sleeper tight end du jour for a lot of people like this offseason. But all that value, like all of those concepts, like all the schematic changes that we can at least somewhat project like for Ryan Grubb as he comes into Seattle. I mean, all of that value of what it could be for JSN, what it could be for Noah Fant, like all that value like intersects at Geno. And since his style of being like more of that aggressive type of quarterback, always wanting to at least like put the ball in the air and like letting his receivers win. And you do have like at least 2 capable winners in DK Metcalf and JSN. We'll see what Lockett can really bring to the table now in his 30-ish or whatever, 30s age like season. All of that again, like it really corresponds with how Geno likes to play and with where each of his receivers are going, along with Noah Fant as well. It really does kind of set up for an easy way for Geno Smith can be like that sleeper quarterback that you need to have like in 2024.
Yeah, I think that last bit really is the big thing for me. It seems like everybody's drafting all 3 of those receivers. I think they're all going in the top 50, and some people are interested in the tight end and the running backs, and yet Geno is still way down where he is. Yeah. I like the pick a lot. John, you have a ex-Seattle Seahawks quarterback as your sleeper.
Yeah, I almost picked Geno, but after touting him last year, I didn't want to remind everybody of that. After a pretty disappointing season in 2023. So, yeah, I picked Russell Wilson, and I think, his current ADP, I think, is really driven by the fact that everybody thinks that he's going to lose his job to Justin Fields, which sort of depends on whether or not you think Wilson is a better quarterback and can get wins for a pretty good, talented, deep, solid defensively, pretty good offensive line for the Pittsburgh Steelers. So, my money is that he's going to be the starter all year, and then he's going to play pretty well. He actually played pretty well last year, 3,070 yards, 26 touchdowns, only 8 interceptions in 15 games. He had the 3rd highest adjusted completion percentage last season. He had the 11th highest PFF grades on deep balls. So he does run the ball still a little bit. He doesn't have a great set of weapons there in Pittsburgh. George Pickens, Pat Freiermuth, and then Roman Wilson and Calvin Austin, and some guys are going to have to step up. But I think if you just want a backup quarterback for really cheap and have some insurance on the roster, he's a good guy to just nab in one of the final rounds, because nobody really believes in him enough to draft him as a QB1 or a high-end QB2.
Russell Wilson was going to be the name I put in the doc before or the Twitter thread, and then I went in there and you had him. So we each took each other's guys, and I'm down here with now Bryce Young, which is probably going to confuse a lot of people because he did absolutely nothing, literally nothing as a rookie. But here's the thing. First of all, number 1 overall quarterbacks almost always end up doing something. There are pretty much 2 guys who never did anything for fantasy. That's Jamarcus Russell and Tim Couch. The 24 other guys to go number 1 in the modern draft era have all ended up doing something for fantasy at some point. Even David Carr, Sam Bradford, Vinny Testaverde was the QB2 overall 1 year behind Brett Favre. The draft capital you get ends up usually paying off. So did he have a terrible season? Yes. But are the odds in his favor to at some point be good? Yes. And I think it can be as soon as this year. And there's a few reasons why. So last year, 4th worst offensive line, according to PFF's end of year rankings. That led to 62 sacks, which is horrible. It was the 2nd most in the league behind Sam Howell, and it had him on his butt way too often, which then affected his ability to play quarterback. His receiving core, it was led by a 33-year-old Adam Thielen, who started off pretty good and then kind of disappeared. And after that, it was Jonathan Mingo, DJ Chark, a couple of running backs that were pretty much backups, and Tommy Tremble. This year, that upgrades with both the addition of Xavier Legette, as I'm pretty sure you're supposed to pronounce it, in the draft, and Deontay Johnson, who is a very good wide receiver, an extremely reliable one, and Jonathan Brooks at running back when healthy, who can catch passes. All three of those guys are just additions on top of what he already had last year. So that's an upgrade. The offensive line, it's only the 13th worst ranked offensive line, according to PFF, as of right now. They signed 2 guards in free agency. They put a little bit of effort into improving there. Is it going to be the best O-line in the league? Probably not. But is it going to be better than it was? Yes. And then the biggest change for me, last year he had a head coach, Frank Reich, who ended up getting fired after 11 games, and a first-year offensive coordinator that went out as well. This year, he gets Dave Canales at head coach, and the offensive coordinator, Brad Idzik, is basically just a Canales disciple that was with him in Seattle and Tampa Bay, and it's coming with him here. So we're basically just getting the Dave Canales situation, the Dave Canales offense. 2 years ago, Dave Canales went and turned a guy we just talked about, Geno Smith, from an utter non-factor who'd never done anything in fantasy into the QB5 and the comeback player of the year. Last year, he took a number 1 overall mini bust. I don't know if we could really call Baker Mayfield a bust before last year, but he certainly hadn't been very relevant for fantasy, into the QB10. Dave Canales might be, from at least this small sample size of 2 guys, the best quarterback whisperer in the NFL right now. If somebody can come in, get behind a quarterback, and turn him into what he was supposed to be when they spent all that capital to get up to number 1 and draft him, I think it might be Dave Canales. So am I drafting Bryce Young as a quarterback 1? No. But do I believe that he could be A, a great backup, B, a QB2 that I'm interested in grabbing, C, a best ball guy that I'm adding as my 3rd quarterback whenever I'm getting 3 quarterbacks, or 2 if I got a really good first one? Yes. I believe in all of that. I believe in the talent. I believe in the draft capital, and I believe in the situation. I believe that Bryce Young can still be good, and I'm not really ready to give up on him just yet.
I dig it. Now, to add to that, so you bring up like Dave Canales, and I think one thing that people might push back on this idea that Canales like won't be able to fix Bryce Young is that, like we talked about Geno Smith, like stylistically, like how he likes to press the ball downfield. And like the same thing for Baker Mayfield. Like he likes to, like we saw that connection with him and Mike Evans, like just will roll out, fire the ball downfield, like hit the perimeter. And then like, that's how like Baker Mayfield was actually able to work like really well, like with Mike Evans last year. Now that is not necessarily like Bryce Young's game to say that he can't do it. I won't go as far as to say that, but actually like last season, Bryce Young on targeting the middle of the field, even despite his short stature, like from shotgun dropbacks and actually using like 5-7 step drop concepts, he was actually like fairly efficient, like across the middle of the field. And so, and my thing is with like Dave Canales, he's more of a, well, what can you do well? And let's hone in on that. And their offseason like additions, like, because you just mentioned, like bringing in like Deontay Johnson, who has like, that was what like his thing, like in terms of like being efficient, like across the middle of the field. That was his thing, like, well, like not just being a high end target earner, but fairly efficient across the middle of the field when he was still with the Steelers. They still have Adam Thielen in place, and we know what he can do, like from the interior portion. Leggett also, like while he was more of an intermediate to deep threat, still capable of running those routes across the middle of the field. So I think with Canales, it's more about just like focusing in on what Bryce Young can do and what he can do well. And since he was like more efficient, like throwing across the middle of the field, adding in like the talent that they have at the wide receiver position in order to really accentuate that, it does really kind of set up for Bryce Young to have that sophomore leap that we expect him to, or at the very least, like we'll just know right off the bat whether or not he can do it, because they have the personnel to really kind of hone in on what Young can do well.
Take note, head coaches. Do what your players do well. Don't try to force them into anything.
It can be that simple.
I just would like to add, I would like to add that Jatavion Sanders at tight end is a kind of a sneaky addition as well. He had 600 yards in his last 2 seasons in Texas, 54 catches and 45 catches. So that's another weapon at the tight end position, which has been kind of dreadful there for a couple of years.
Yeah.
It was pretty much as bad as it can be around Bryce Young last year, so it's going to be a lot better, and they put in the work to make it so.
The other thing is we've seen, and I'll make this very brief, we've seen receivers really drastically improve when they change teams. You know, like Stephon Diggs to Buffalo, really.
AJ Brown to Philly.
Josh Allen, and I think Deontay Johnson from a route running standpoint, even he's not like your classic alpha, he's going to really help Bryce Young.
Agree.
Yeah. Good point. All right, let's go to running back. Chris, all three of these names, we just named a bunch of starting quarterbacks everybody knows. These three names, unless you're deep in the fantasy streets, you may not recognize. So who's your running back?
So I'm going to make a bet on at least not necessarily talent, because we haven't really seen it yet with Roschon Johnson, running back like for the Chicago Bears. I'm going to make a bet on situation. So DeAndre Swift comes over from the Eagles after having a relatively productive season. Now I say relatively productive because just given the state of the Eagles offensive line, we know how efficient most running backs can be in that particular situation. Up until this past year, obviously with Jason Kelce retiring, we'll see what Saquon can do in a similar situation in 2024. But at the very least, it was essentially the best spot or best environment for a guy like DeAndre Swift to really shine in terms of, we never saw him get the full workload when he was there in Detroit. Everybody was upset, with the draft capital Detroit spent on him. The fact that he was supposed to be this hybrid running back, both pass catcher and can work between the tackles as a runner and all this other stuff. We never saw it happen. And so we get that with the Eagles. And where did he finish at? By the end of the season? Now I get the tush push and all that took a lot of touchdowns away from him. What was he RB19? By the end of the season? With all that workload and all that? Okay, well, all right, fine. So now he moves over to the Bears. And I'm not as concerned about what he can bring to the Bears from a talent standpoint. I get the guaranteed money, he's going to be effectively the starter and so on and so forth. But Roschon Johnson at the back end of last season really did start to take over the carries, that not just the overall not the overall workload, at least the workload that matters for fantasy, especially for running backs that we're going to be drafting towards the back end of our fantasy drafts. Using the utilization report that's powered by Dwayne McFarland's brain that works over at Fantasy Life with us, shows that the inside the 5 carries that did wind up becoming more of Roschon's role towards the back end of the season. And Shane Waldron, we were just talking about him and his move over from Seattle to Chicago. He does call more of a, I would say, just slightly more conservative offense once they get into scoring position. For the last 3 seasons when he was with Seattle, the Seahawks, their pass rate over expectation once they got into the red zone, all negative, towards the back end of the league, or at the very least league average in terms of passing rate. Now, could that be personnel driven? Absolutely. But now are we also going to say that with this rookie quarterback, regardless of all the weapons that we love, DJ Moore getting his new contract, Rome Odunze doing these highlights in training camp, Keenan Allen doing his old man thing and being a high-end target earner, all of that. But now are we going to say that we're expecting Caleb Williams in his first season to also be a part of this high-flying passing game? I don't know. But if we are going to say that there's a chance that they are going to run a bit more once they get into the red zone. We don't know if Swift is really capable of being an efficient red zone running back, because the Eagles damn sure didn't really use him in that way last year. Can Roschon take over some of that workload? And I say yes, because he just did it last season. So I don't know how all the stuff with Khalil Herbert is going to work out. There have been those rumors of him not even making the team, or him potentially moving on, getting traded midseason, any of the other stuff. But at the very least, we do know with the draft capital that the Bears use on Roschon, they should have plans for him coming into the 2024 season. And also Swift, I'm not sure that he's going to be the guy for the entirety of the season. So if there is a guy that out of that backfield that we do know is going to be a part of a good offense with the personnel they have in place, Roschon should be that guy if Herbert isn't going to be there for the long haul. So I'm taking Roschon as a potential sleeper for 2024.
I have a few dynasty rosters that would be very well blessed by Roschon Johnson taking over there, so I like it. Yep. John, we fought over your guy for all of 12 seconds, and then I said, okay, I'll take somebody else. Who do you got?
Yeah, I was looking for somebody else. Then you're forget it. I'll just find somebody else. Ray Davis, who I learned just now is actually Raymond Davis, RE''MAHN.
I did not know that.
Okay.
Yeah, he's going by. Well, I searched for him over at the college football stats, and he did not come up, so I had to figure out what was going on there. Kentucky, after a couple seasons at Vanderbilt, last 2 seasons over 1,000 yards rushing, 29 catches at Vanderbilt as a senior, and then 33 as a senior again at Kentucky. can catch the ball. And I think at the end of the drafts, and I'm noticing he's just there in the final rounds. His ADP is like 17th round. You're just looking for, or I'm just looking for talented or semi-talented, possibly talented running backs who are one injury away from a big role. Yep. And he might even have a weekly role if they decide not to try to give James Cook any goal line carries and they want to kind of scale back Josh Allen's workload around the goal line as well. So, he could see 6 to 8 touchdowns rushing and have a 4 to 8 carry type role just in the regular scheme of things. And then if something were to happen to Cook, he would, vault into the RB2 rankings.
I mean, I like it because he was going to be my guy. Very much on board here. What you said about in this range of drafts, we're looking for someone who, if there's an injury or a job is won or usage is shifted, suddenly someone becomes a weekly usable RB2. That applies to both of your guys' picks, and I think applies to mine. I'm taking Will Shipley, a rookie running back for the Eagles, out of Clemson, was a 5-star recruit, 3-year starter at Clemson, had 31 career rushing touchdowns and 85 catches, which included 31 and 38 in each of his last 2 seasons. And that really is the key point for Shipley. I think he is a very accomplished pass catcher, but also versatile really across the board. He does a lot of things decently well. He's not particularly elite in any one factor or aspect of his game, but he does a lot well. He can run the ball well. He has good vision. He doesn't necessarily have bell cow size by any means, but that's why the Eagles drafted him in the 4th round with Saquon Barkley already there on a 3-year deal. And with everything we've seen from Shipley, everything we've seen in his profile, I think he'd already be a somewhat intriguing 3rd down / change of pace back behind Barkley going into this year. But we are now also getting some major hype out of training camp. Shipley got a bunch of first-team reps with Saquon Barkley away from practice for a personal issue, and the rave reviews for Shipley were coming out hot and heavy on Twitter. Elliot Shore-Parks, is one of the best Eagles beat reporters, said on Monday that it was a big Will Shipley day, in quotes. Finished practice with 5 total touches with the first-team offense, most of any player on the field. Also had a highlight catch down the sideline between 2 defenders. Just like what John threw out. This is a rookie coming in who has shown the ability and got the draft capital to be used in the offense. Is he going to immediately supplant the number 1? No, probably not. Definitely not in this case. But if there is an injury, all of a sudden you have a guy who could be the RB1 for the Eagles, which is a very nice place to be. And even if there's not, I'm kind of getting sneaky like Duke Johnson vibes from Shipley a little bit. I think he could be a consideration in deeper PPR or even half PPR drafts and a very, very strong handcuff to Barkley. So if you're in a PPR league, if you're in any sort of league that rewards catches, I think you should go out and grab him with the last pick of the draft. I was horrifically sniped in the Scott Fish Bowl from doing so. I had the 103 and I took somebody else going into the short turn with my very last pick, and someone at the turn took him. It was the end of my Scott Fish Bowl career. I am horrifically sad. All right, let's move to wide receiver. Your guy, Chris, had a very strong stretch last year, but appears to be forgotten again. Who do you got?
I'll take Demarcus Robinson for the Rams. I don't see why people don't like, touchdowns or targets, or I don't know, just people out there just generally doing stuff that's conducive to fantasy. I mean, I don't know. I kind of like that stuff. But I get it. Now, this is the same Demarcus Robinson that was the 4th, 5th, 6th option on the Chiefs just like 3 or 4 years ago. He was like the 2nd, 3rd, like the 3rd or 4th option on the Ravens, maybe like a couple years ago. I mean, he's played with like multiple MVP quarterbacks and has not been fantasy relevant. And then lo and behold, he goes to the Rams, and all of a sudden, like he's become like a guy, or at least like somewhat fantasy relevant, right? I mean, multiple games around, 8, 9, 10 targets, like over the last 6 or 7 games, like in the during the regular season of last year. like a couple of 100-yarders, if I'm remembering right. I should take that back. I don't think it was like at the very least, like getting into the end zone a few times and overtaking the job that should have been for a guy like Tutu Atwell. But now, is that sustainable? Or what part of his game, or what does he bring to the offense that actually allows him to not necessarily repeat what he did last year? Because if that's the case, like drafting him in the 17th, 18th round, like as most folks are right now, seems like a ludicrous value. But I will say that there are parts to like what he brings to the table as a wide receiver that should at least give us some confidence that he'll have at least a similar role in 2024. First, the way that the Sean McVay likes to call plays, the way the Rams offense like is set up, they do run like 3 wide receiver sets at the highest rate like in the league. Like 95% of the plays that are out there, like they have like 3 wide receivers on the play. I think the next highest is like the Bengals, if I'm remembering correctly, somewhere around like 90-ish%. And that was both with Joe Burrow on the field and with Jake Browning. But they always have 3 wide receivers out there. And without them having a massive investment like at the wide receiver position, it doesn't really seem like they're going to go back to what Ben Skoranek or Tutu Atwell or Van Jefferson's with the Steelers now. So they don't have any other options there. So at the very least, you do get a guy that's going to be running at the very least wind sprints. Let's just put that. We'll just say right now he's going to be getting his cardio in on a weekly basis. Let's see if he can actually earn targets during the weeks where it was both him and Cooper Kupp, and Puka Nacua, like still earning about like 11 to 12% of the targets, which like you'll say that's not a ton. And I understand that, but at least he was earning targets once they did get into the red zone. And that is something that we should be concerned about. Now, this is the same team that will not have Tyler Higbee for at least the earlier parts of the season. We'll see what Colby Parkinson can what he brings to the table coming down from Seattle. Like they still do need like a third option, like in the red zone. For most of the time while Cooper Kupp was out, they were trying to look for Puka Nacua to be that like red zone target, and defenses started to shift that way. He wasn't as successful once they got into the red zone, like was Puka Nacua, like in his rookie season. Now, if you do have Cooper Kupp back, can Demarcus Robinson still continue to create and be that target earner once they get into the red zone? TBD. But at the very least, what also allows for Robinson to stay on the field in 2024 is the fact that he's a good blocker, good run blocker. The fact that Sean McVay has been this like play caller, play sequencer, allowing the run play to really be like at least well integrated into their passing game. So like Kyron Williams was such like a big hit like last year, and Demarcus Robinson can do most of the blocking. Think about like what Robert Woods like was for that team a few seasons ago before he moved on to the Texans. Now, Demarcus Robinson, last I checked, is a much larger specimen than Tutu Atwell. So if you are out there needing somebody that can both block and catch and do like both of those parts and pieces, that's going to be a requirement for that offense. Robinson at least allows for some of that, like more so than Tutu Atwell. So while I don't think Robinson is going to be this top 24 wide receiver, he might have spike weeks that allow him to do that. But where he's being drafted at right now, like he does have like a lot more contingent value on a week-to-week basis. Like you can toss him into your flex like more often than not, because he will get those targets. He will at least be able to at least earn those looks like in the red zone that will allow him to at least be something of a PPR factor in fantasy for 2024.
There's also just the reality that Cooper Kupp's missed a few games a couple years in a row now. If he or Puka miss some time, DeMarcus all of a sudden is the wide receiver too, most likely in a very good offense. So I like it.
I want to underline something that he said, that Chris said there was the snaps. It was the last 3 games, week 15 through 17, 95%, 93%, 92%. Week 14, 86%. And then the 2 previous weeks, 60%. And before that, he hadn't played more than, I don't think, 15% of the snaps. In those last 4 games, 14 through 17, 10 targets, 3 targets, 6 targets, and then 10 targets again. Did not crack 100 yards, but did have 82 yards and 92 yards in back-to-back weeks, and had 4 straight touchdown games as well. And I think he's absolutely locked into that wide receiver 3 role. And he's probably one of these better and best ball guys where he's going to pop his head up and get some starts for you, but you probably won't want to start him in a regular redraft league on a regular basis unless it's pretty deep.
I like it. All right, John, your guy we have touched on a little bit. He is the least sleepy sleeper technically in this entire grouping, all the way up in the 12th round. Tell us about your guy.
Well, I hope Connor Allen is listening, because he and I got into an argument about Josh Palmer, and he kind of hurt my feelings. And we were trying to. I was trying to draft him main event league, and he just kind of put the kibosh on it, and I wasn't real happy about it. But
he's such a hater.
He basically was just like meh. But if you dig in to Palmer, he's interesting because of all the targets that are available there. We think Ladd McConkey is going to be pretty good. We're not 100% sure. We're not sure he's going to be able to handle 120 plus targets himself. I mean, he didn't have huge college stats. So looking at Palmer, who's their most established veteran receiver, he set career highs in yards per game, yards per catch, 58.1 and 15.3 respectively. Yards per route run, 1.71, which is 38th out of 102 eligible receivers. He obviously had some games where Mike Williams was out, Keenan Allen were out. Then there were some games where they all played together. Palmer averaged 74 yards in the 4 games that he played with Allen and without Williams. And one of those games was cut short due to injury. In the 3 games he played without Allen, both Allen and Williams, he posted 113, 47, 44 yards receiving, which is a 68-yard average. Connor Allen was very quick to point out that 113-yard game was because of a busted coverage. I don't know if that's true or not. I took that as it would be true. But without Williams, he played at a 73 catch, 1,209 yard, 2.4 touchdown pace. Those are low-end wide receiver 2 numbers. So gaming this out, we think, Quentin Johnston, I'm not, readying myself for a breakout season from him. DJ Chark had his moments in the sun, not a great route runner according to reception perception, probably getting past his prime in terms of being a, regular contributor. I think you have McConkey and Palmer in the wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 role, and I don't know which one's going to be the wide receiver 1. So if you have a player that's going wide receiver 59, who was playing at a 1,200-yard pace last year without Williams, Mike Williams, who's gone, and also Keenan Allen is also gone. This is just a great value. Now, would you want him as your wide receiver 6 or 7 on a main event team when you're dealing with Connor Allen and having to listen to him complain about Josh Palmer constantly filling up the roster or whatever on the bench, wanting to use that spot for some random RB4 on the Broncos? No, maybe not. I don't know. But I think certainly in best ball, and I think in regular redraft leagues, if you are if you fade receiver at all and you're trying to throw some darts at the position to hopefully cobble together 3 or 4 guys that you can start on a weekly basis, I think Josh Palmer is a great target.
Listen, if you're looking to replace Connor next year, you let me know, because I will fully support drafting Josh Palmer at and before his current ADP. So love that. My guy is another rookie. I'm smashing the rookies here. Can you tell that I play Dynasty a lot? It's Javon Baker for the New England Patriots. Now, I will be clear. I also really like Jalen Polk. I technically like Jalen Polk better, but so does ADP. He's going 5 rounds higher than Baker, so I felt like Baker was the better deep sleeper pick here. And there's a couple reasons why. One, the depth chart in New England. It pretty much looks like Polk, and then Kendrick Bourne, who's recovering from injury, and in many ways, Baker is just better, younger Kendrick Bourne. And then there's KJ Osborne, Demario Douglas, whatever's left of Juju Smith-Schuster, which isn't very much, and Jalen Reagor, which is less than very much. There is so much opportunity there for both Polk and Baker to step up and be the 1-2 on this team. And I think that's what the Patriots wanted and intended coming into this draft season when they took Polk in the 2nd round and then took Baker in the 4th round. I think both of these guys are going to get every chance to be the 1-2 in the target rotation for New England. Now, it is New England. How much does that matter? Well, we'll see. Jacoby Brissett has supported some decent fantasy seasons, or at least stretches of fantasy seasons for wide receivers before. And if and when Drake May gets the job, which I expect will happen at some point, it usually does for people drafted as high as May was, Drake May has proven to be a competent quarterback. He can definitely get the ball downfield, which is something Baker will thrive in. If you have been on Twitter, or at least Patriots Twitter, which I certainly am, you have seen clips of Javon Baker, highlight specialists so far in camp, reportedly turning all kinds of heads. The news is very solid on him and Polk. And Baker did the same thing at the Senior Bowl. And anyone who gets hype at the Senior Bowl is automatically on my radar as a rookie in Dynasty, whatever it may be. So Senior Bowl, hype. Training camp, hype. Interested in both those things. Both those things start to get me excited. And I think that in reality, with both these two playing at the top of the depth chart, it might really be a 1A, 1B situation because Jalen Polk is more like a jump ball contested catch type guy, although they're pretty much the same size. Baker is more the outside burner type of player, like the upgraded Kendrick Bourne, like I mentioned. It would take a lot to go right for him to hit and be like a consistently startable fantasy asset in redraft. I do think he's a very strong better in best ball type, like John mentioned a little bit earlier with Robinson. If you can slide Baker in as your 5th, 6th wide receiver in a best ball league, I love that. I think he's going to have several weeks where he hits on a big play, scores touchdowns. But I do think he wins the job as the 2 or 3 or maybe 1B if things go really well. I do think that will come with targets. We're going to need good quarterback play to really, really like what we get from him season long. And the offense needs to improve in general. But this is a deep sleepers. We're in the 19th round here with Javon Baker. So a lot has to go right with all these guys for it to hit. And I like it.
And I would add that I tried to convince Connor Allen to take Jalen Polk as our wide receiver 7, and he refused because it did not fit our
unbelievable
roster construction. We would never start him. Which he had a point, but it was really sad to pass on him to draft Juwan Johnson.
Oh my gosh. Well, I guess it's a FFPC, so I can understand that. But to your point, Matt, having a guy like Javon Baker, it fits what Drake May did in his final season, or like last 2 seasons at UNC, like stylistically, more of an air raid type of offense. May out of his quarterback class, he had the highest like passing average depth of target, is around like 11 yards. And like over like Baker's like last 2 seasons at UCF, he was around like a 13, 15, like 17 yard average depth of target, like from a passing standpoint, receiving standpoint rather. So if you would like to pair your rookie quarterback with a guy that does like it can play that classical like X receiver, run down field, win in contested catch type situations. I mean, it doesn't really it does fit like some of what Polk can do. We saw him do that a little bit when he was at Washington, but I wouldn't say that's really like Pop Douglas's game. I wouldn't say that is really like KJ Osborne's game. And like for certain, that's not Juju Smith-Schuster. And actually, Demario Douglas, I heard earlier today or yesterday, he pulled up with like a hamstring injury at training camp. So we'll see if that should allow a guy like Javon Baker to get a bit more time, either with Jacoby Brissett or Drake May. But I think like from a stylistic standpoint, if once May gets out there in the field, I can see an easy connection like between him and Javon Baker, just the way that they both play the game.
I like it. I think that's why they got him. All right. Well, John, you were forced to take Juwan Johnson over Polk in the FFPC draft. Fortunately, Chris is here to make you feel better about that pick. So let's get to the tight ends. Chris, what do you got?
Yeah, so obviously, like caveating all of that with, we'll see like where Juwan Johnson can like where he's at from a health standpoint. He had to have surgery, that had foot surgery. What was that, about 6 weeks ago, I think, or almost like 2 months ago, when the Saints announced that he was going to like be down for a little bit, like due to a foot issue, had the surgery. And at least from some of the beat reporters, I've seen like Nick Underhill and some other folks that follow the Saints like fairly closely, showing him already back at practice, not practicing, but at least out there on the field, showing a little bit of speed, being able to work in as that like maybe potentially like 3rd pass catcher like in the rotation. But we'll always have like the Taysom Hill. What's the bit that Denny Carter does? Like Taysom Hill's package continues to grow. Like from every week, like it seems to be like coaches are talking up how much more they're going to try and use Taysom, how much he's still going to be incorporated into this offense. And my thought was with Kubiak's son like coming over and being the OC for the Saints, that all that nonsense was going to be gone. We wouldn't get that bullshit like where Taysom, like they'd drive down the field, Derek Carr would do his thing and actually like show some flashes of him being legitimate quarterback. But then once they got within the 10, they'd swap him out. Taysom Hill would be under center and then run the ball in from 10 yards out. I mean, it worked. If you roster Taysom, have him as a tight end or whatever, of course it wound up working out for you. But for anybody that had Chris Olave on their roster, had Juwan Johnson on their roster, or were looking for flashes like from Rashid Shaheed, which has now become one of the wide receivers that a lot of folks can't stop drafting this season, probably wanted that touchdown to go from anybody else. Like, even if you wanted a rushing touchdown, you definitely didn't want it from Taysom Hill because you're hoping Alvin Kamara would be doing something. But I digress. But I think the biggest point is, like, last season when Juwan Johnson like actually came back from injury, it was like week by week he was starting to increase his route participation, also increasing his targets per route run, and was slowly chipping away at Taysom Hill's hold, like on that role within the offense. Like, he went from like he already had like he was up to about a 65% like route participation, which for tight ends, not so great like overall, but at least amongst all the pass catchers, that was second. That was ahead of Taysom Hill, like once he actually got things going. Targets per route run was second on the team at about 15%. So it's like, if he already had that role last season, and that was with Taysom doing his thing, with all of the other pass catchers really not showing a ton. We didn't really get a ton from A.T. Perry. Haven't heard much more out of training camp about Perry really showing off his skill set. So really, like for Johnson, his largest competition for targets right now, it's going to be Olave. It's going to be Shaheed. Kamara's going to mix in for his. And afterwards, like, that's really all he has to contend with. So since he was able to, one, instantly increase his route participation and also his targets per route run last season, and with this offense like being, I would say, less of a deep passing type of offense, especially given the fact that offensive line is in a little bit of turmoil, we'll just put it nicely, and also that defense right now is going to be like one of these at below league average. I could see like at least a number of shootouts like for the Saints. And if it's not going to be Olave, if it's not going to be Shaheed, I think Johnson is the one that might be the biggest beneficiary of all of that for 2024. So from where he's being taken at right now in drafts, like, I like where Johnson is going, and like I'll take him as like a sleeper tight end for this season.
Speaking of dynasty rosters, I have another one where TJ Hawkinson is my main tight end, but he's out, and I have Juwan Johnson and Taysom Hill as my other option.
Bold, yeah.
So I'm all aboard for this, and I'll just jump in here because my tight end sleeper is Taysom Hill. And believe it or not, both these things can be true. It's not like Chris and I are really at disagreement here, because Taysom Hill is not really a tight end. He's not really going to get a lot of targets. That's not where he gets his fantasy value. But for some reason, he continues to get it every year. The package continues to grow every year, and yet the fantasy community seems insistent on ignoring him, as if the weirdness of his non-existent position makes him some sort of Bigfoot that's not real. I don't get it. He counts as a tight end on most fantasy sites. That is what matters. And in the last 2 years, tight end 10 last year with 127 fantasy points in half PPR. Tight end 5 the year before that with 141 fantasy points. Tight end 10, tight end 5. Both those numbers are quite a bit smaller than tight end 26, which is where he's going now. Make it make sense, somebody. I do not understand. And it's not like he hasn't been consistent either. I think that the mindset is, well, we have no idea what's going to happen with Taysom Hill, so how can we possibly draft him? He has scored at least 5 scrimmage touchdowns in 5 straight seasons, plus thrown in some passing touchdowns along the way. You want to know other actual tight ends who have done that over the last 5 seasons? Their names are Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews, and that is the end of the list. He is consistent. He is going to score touchdowns. And reportedly, to Chris's point, he is doing new things that he's never done before in the new offensive coordinator Clint Kubiak's offensive scheme, which means he might even see more snaps this year. The package does continue to grow. I have been a Taysom Hill fan for years. I used to have it in my Twitter bio, I think, that I was a Taysom Hill truther. It's not there right now. I've been banging the drum on him since the Drew Brees days, when everybody was upset when they took Drew Brees off the field and put Taysom Hill on the field. But here's the thing, and the offense, whoever has been in the coaching staff has recognized this. When he touches the ball, good things happen for the offense. He's efficient. He gets first downs. He scores touchdowns in the red zone. And it works for the Saints. I think it's going to continue to be used that way for the Saints, and that means it can work for fantasy. I don't mind drafting him as a tight end 1. I mean, it's crazy and you don't have to do it, but if you need to, or if you just punt on tight end, I don't mind it. He has finished there 2 years in a row, and the fact that he's tight end 26 makes absolutely no sense.
Well, I have him
John?
at tight end. I have him at tight end 13. So
There you
I
go.
would agree with
There
all
we go.
that. And it does sound like, and the big question is he going to have the same role that he had last year, or at least something similar? So
It'll be something. I can tell you that
we
much.
shall see.
It's always something. All right, your guy is a guy we've also hit on a couple times. It's maybe I'm starting to get the impression might be one of your favorite players in 2024. This is one of your my guys. Who's your tight end?
Yeah, Jonnu Smith. I keep pounding the table for him, and very happy to get him last night in the Pros versus Joes as my tight end 2. He was the tight end 19 half PPR formats last year. He had the 15th most receiving yards, 582 at his position. Great athlete. He was the thorn in the side of all the Kyle Pitts managers out there. And I just trust Mike McDaniel. I think that they went out and got him for his speed and ability for yak. And, people asked him, well, it didn't really work with Gesicki or Durham Smythe. And he basically just said, quote, some people think that just whatever it was, it will always be, end quote, which to me is like this perplexing cryptic way of saying, no, I'm planning to use him and use his speed. I think he'll be a great addition to that offense and have loads of single coverage and space to run because of all the other weapons in that offense. So love to get him as my tight end 2. And if I don't get a stud tight end, which is usually my plan, and I'm sitting there just kind of punting the position, in addition to Taysom Hill, who, whether you're drafting at what site might determine whether or not he's eligible for tight end, Jonnu Smith is a great option, as well as just I wouldn't be surprised at all if he finishes like tight end 12 or tight end 10. I don't think he's going to be a big volume guy, but I think he'll be highly effective in the role that he has.
McDaniels knows what he likes, and we like what he likes because it works for the offense. So I'm on board.
And I think the biggest thing though is that I believe that the Dolphins have been trying to identify, let's say, a reliable third pass catcher in that offense, since McDaniel got there. Like they did their thing with Cedric Wilson. And I mean, I get that they tried what they had Chase Claypool there for a while, and that flamed out like most expected it to. And so I get him wanting to, they obviously have a type, right? They want speed. They want all this speed, but finding a reliable pass catcher that can work the middle of the field. I mean, they haven't really been able to fill that gap on the roster. And there's some hope, or I would say that just based off of where folks are drafting him, there's some hope that Achane kind of fills in part of that. I mean, we're already kind of projecting him to take over the lion's share of the running back carries from Raheem Mostert, but I would assume with where he's being drafted at now, there's some receiving component to that wasn't there as much as it was during his rookie year. So I'm not going to put all that on the running back. There also has to be some other wide receiver to that game, to that passing core that will allow them to still create explosives like they have been throughout the past 2-3 seasons. So I think Jonnu Smith, for my money, he's probably their best option at this point. And drafting him where he's going right now, that's a massive value. At least it's an easy bet to make with a massive payoff if we're right.
Yeah. And I will throw out there, Tua's passing touchdowns have increased each successive season he's been in the NFL. And with how many rushing touchdowns over expectation they had last year, just an absurd rushing touchdown efficiency rate from those running backs, I think that comes down, but the offense stays just as good, if not better, which means I think the passing touchdowns goes up, which means the receiving touchdowns goes up, and somebody's going to get those besides the top 2 receivers, and I think Jonnu might be the best bet for it, so I like it.
I'm interested also in Odell Beckham. They signed him.
Yeah.
Washington, they drafted him as well. How they're going to incorporate all these weapons in the offense. And, Beckham is kind of a sleeper as well. If there's an injury to Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle, you could see him with 1,000 yards pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
Rising tides lift all boats, and the tides are rising in Florida. All right. We will quick hit our flex guys. So just give me your name and a couple sentences. Chris, who do you got?
I'll stick with a team that's near and dear to my heart. So I'm Southwest Ohio. I've been a Bengals fan, a long-suffering Bengals fan. I just wish they had been able to get me that Super Bowl a couple of years ago. I'm not bitter about that
So
at all.
close.
Yeah, no. I mean, if Aaron Donald wasn't like a freak of nature, we would have we had that in the bag. But either way, Andre Yoshivas for the Bengals. I know that they drafted Jermaine Burton this season as like their potential like Tyler Boyd replacement, but it does seem like Yoshi like in spot starts like last season, whether it was Jamar Chase when he was banged up and out, and or like T. Higgins out as well. I mean, Yoshi actually did show that he was capable of like working both as a perimeter wide receiver, but also working on the interior as well. So if we're assuming with Jamar Chase doing his hold out, hold in, or whatever, he's back and ready to go by week 1. T is also healthy and ready to go in week 1. And they are still looking for that third wide receiver on top of having Mike Gesicki, Tanner Hudson, and Drew, like all the other tight ends. Yoshi like has been able to show he's been effective from a yards per route run standpoint, like from the interior. So I would take him as a guy that if I'm drafting late, I'll take Yoshi.
Love it. John, you also took a wide receiver with your flex.
Yeah, Josh Downs. I've been trying to add him. He's really lighting up camp. He finished the season as a rookie wide receiver 44. He had 4 catches for 45 yards, 0.12 touchdowns on 5.8 targets per game. So he's earning targets, even though he was the number 2 or number 3 option in that offense for most of the season. His head coach, Shane Steichen, said that Downs is to Steichen, quote, taking it to another level this offseason, and Downs fared very well in Matt Harmon's charting over reception perception. Harmon said, Josh Downs is an excellent football player, full stop. The only concern here is he's playing with a running quarterback. With Michael Pittman there, is there enough targets to go around? I think that, Downs will probably be an inconsistent fantasy starter for you, but it's a nice guy to have on the offense or on your roster just to plug in here and there during bye weeks. And if there's any sort of injury to Pittman, he's going to be the first one in line, I think, for targets in that offense.
I bet you Connor probably hates him too. If I had to bet, Connor probably hates Josh
all the good
Downs,
receivers down here in the sleeper rounds he apparently hates, so I wouldn't be surprised.
I wouldn't surprise me.
All right. We'll close it out with my guy. It is not a receiver, but in fact a tight end, and not just a tight end, but a rookie tight end. Yes. I'm going crazy and buying into the rookie tight ends are now a thing hype. Not really, but I do like this guy, and the hype really comes from his athleticism. It is Ben Sinnott, 53rd overall pick for the Commanders in the draft, which was much higher than was expected. And he is an athletic freak. He had a 40-inch vertical, a 10-foot 6-inch broad jump, a 6.82 3-cone drill. All of those were the best at the position at the combine. His relative athletic score, if you've ever seen those snapshots floating around Twitter, was a 9.73 out of a 10. That is legitimately elite. He's a little undersized, but he was used very versatilely at Kansas State, and this is the direction the tight end position is going. Versatile. You don't have to be the huge guy that you used to be to play the position, and you can catch passes and explode downfield. I really like his upside, and young quarterbacks tend to like tight ends. It is a reliable target. It helps you, get your momentum going. I'm on board. There's Terry McLaurin here, and Zach Ertz is technically ahead of him on the depth chart. I think he jumps Ertz, and then McLaurin's really the only guy who's probably guaranteed to get more targets. I think Sinnott could be a surprise. That was a lot of sleepers, very deep ones. Hopefully, everybody here drafts all of them in their last 5 rounds. I think that's how it works. Thanks a ton, Chris, for coming on, and a absolute wealth of good information. Just for signing off, let everybody know where they can find you and your stuff.
You can find me on Twitter, X, whatever. I'm just calling it Twitter. I'm not calling it X.
We are too.
We've
gone over every pod.
Maybe it's because I'm old. I turned 41 this year. Maybe I'm just getting old, but it's just Twitter to me. But at Chris Allen FFWX, the FFWX is the WX is for weather. So if you ever have any questions, go first, DM John, and then because then John will DM me, and then that's how we'll keep the information going. So don't DM me, DM John, because he'll have already DM'd me, and then he'll let y'all know whatever the weather stuff is. But for any other draft strategies, player takes, any of that stuff, come and find me over at Fantasy Life, fantasylife.com. Free newsletter every day, draft strategy articles out. shows on Monday and Wednesday with Ian Harditz, so the Fantasy Life podcast. So come check me out like on their Fantasy Life YouTube channel as well. But yeah, I appreciate y'all having me on. Oh, and I'd be remiss because I know I'll get a text message if I don't say it. But shout out to Jen Akins, my wonderful editor while I was here. I wish I was doing the show with you as well. Invite me back onto your podcast at some point as well too. But I had to give her a shout out like while I was here. But hi, Jen. We'll do a show again soon. But thanks to both of y'all for having me on, man.
It was great to see you. And before we go, Matt, I just want to mention that today is the last day for 444's early bird pricing. And Luis, in his infinite wisdom, has added another 10% off if you use code last day, all caps, one word, last day. So get that in tonight, July 31st. Maybe it'll work on August 1st. Might work if you're listening to this later. But this is the last day for early bird pricing with the additional 10% off. Get that subscription.
Get in there. It's all this good stuff you heard today and more. All right. Thanks a ton, guys. We'll see you next time. Adios.